warm welcome. You're watching World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. This week, the US announced landmark new sanctions on two of Russia's largest oil producers, Rosneft and Lukoil. Two oil producers that the US blames for funding the Kremlin's war machine. Remember, this is Trump administration's first big move targeting Russia's war, one that could imply penalties for Indian banks too. The US Treasury has set a November 21 deadline. Naturally, Indian refiners are already reviewing orders. This as India shifts to alternative sources despite the profit margins from Russian oil. So what are the options for India? Buy a lot more from India's traditional oil suppliers in West Asia, perhaps also increase imports from other regions, West Africa and Latin America, even the US. But here's food for thought. Prime Minister Modi is only attending the ASEAN summit virtually in Kuala Lumpur, meaning the highly anticipated meet with the US president is not happening. A development that now suggests that the trade deal is still a distant dream. In fact, until the Diwali phone call by Trump to Modi, the prospect of a trade deal was highly probable, with India's assurance of a gradual reduction in its import of Russian oil and opening of India's agro sector to more US exports. But none of that happened. Instead, Trump has continued his claims of mediating between India and Pakistan and railed on about India's continuing import of Russian oil. So has Trump's pressure tactic of sanctioning Russian oil companies arrived as a blessing in disguise for India? One that will now preserve the status quo of New Delhi and Moscow's balanced strategic partnership. Because India is now forced to reduce Russian oil import because of US high-handedness, not because of New Delhi's own economic and diplomatic compulsions. We bring you the headlines. US decision to sanction Russia's two largest oil companies threatens to disrupt the energy lifeline linking Moscow to its biggest customers in Asia, but without causing an immediate supply shock. Prime Minister Narendra Modi will not travel to Malaysia for the ASEAN Leaders Summit, but will attend the meeting virtually on October 26 instead. US President Donald Trump announced that the US is terminating all trade negotiations with Canada, citing a Canadian television advertisement he said misrepresented US tariffs and aimed to influence court decisions. India formally upgrades technical mission in Kabul to embassy. The decision follows Jaishankar's recent meeting with Afghan counterpart Amir Khan Muttaqi, during which he indicated India's intention to enhance its diplomatic presence in Kabul. And flight disruptions could worsen as the United States government shutdown continues. Air traffic controllers have now missed their first full paycheck, raising concerns about staffing shortages and potential safety risks across the nation's aviation network. So, US has sanctioned two of the biggest Russian oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil, in a bid to pressurize Russia into stopping the war in Ukraine. Global oil prices went up by 5% after Trump's move. This is the first time Trump has put Ukraine-related sanctions on Russia during his second term. Responding to Trump's fresh sanctions, the Russian president stated that Moscow will never bow down to US pressure. And in fact, Trump said that he's glad that Putin feels that way. It's also how it all works out is what the US president has stated. We bring you more in our next report.
US President Donald Trump announced this week that he was imposing significant new sanctions on Russia for the first time in his second term. These sanctions imposed by the Treasury Department are primarily against two Russian oil conglomerates, Rosneft and Lukoil. But the move also underscores a degree of frustration on Trump's part with the Russian President Vladimir Putin after a plan for both leaders to meet in Budapest in Hungary fell apart. The new sanctions were announced just as President Trump sat down in the Oval Office with NATO's Secretary General Mark Rutte. Rutte had specially flown down to Washington. There were concerns among a coalition of European leaders who are desperate to ensure that Trump is on the side of Ukraine. Rutte happened to be their chosen messenger.
They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world, but they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push, hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelensky will be reasonable. Very good relations. relationship.
Trump's irritation with Russian President Vladimir Putin was evident in the joint meeting with Rutte. He explained his decision to cancel the Budapest summit that he had planned for some time in the next couple of weeks. Trump had a 2.5-hour-long phone call with Putin just last week, and the very next day he met with Zelensky at the White House and cancelled his much-touted plan to sell the Ukrainians with long-range Tomahawk missiles. But now, after Russia's seeming non-cooperation, President Trump has decided to cancel his upcoming summit with President Putin, which was supposed to happen in Budapest in 2 weeks' time. Secretary of State Marco Rubio was also supposed to meet his counterpart, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, this week. That too stands cancelled. Trump explained his decision by saying that something just didn't feel right about the proposed meeting with Putin.
When we canceled the meeting with President Putin, it didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like we were going to get to the place we have to get, so I canceled it. But we'll do it in the future. But next week we'll be with many of you in those locations that I told you. Then it's back to Washington.
The sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil are among the most significant measures that the United States has taken against Russian energy since the beginning of this war in Ukraine. The Biden administration had avoided levying sanctions against these oil companies so that it would allow for legal purchases of Russian oil by American allies, whether in Europe or in other countries. But Trump targeting these companies could make a meaningful dent in Russia's oil revenues. Russia made a total of over $200 billion in its oil and oil product exports in 2024. Rosneft itself made about $12 billion and Lukoil about $10 billion in net income in 2024. But that contribution has fallen substantially in 2025 because of the threat of sanctions and because other countries have moved away from Russian oil. But the key here is going to be enforcement. Secondary sanctions would also target countries that do financial business with Russia. China and India happen to be the two biggest importers of Russian oil. So these set of sanctions on Rosneft and Lukoil will likely impact both China and India, and Trump is hoping that that would put pressure on the Kremlin.
So when it comes